What would you do if someone took everything from you? Your family, your fortune, your future, everything that made you who you are? Most people would seek justice through the law. Some would seek revenge through violence. But what if I told you about someone who chose a different path entirely? This is the story of Marcus Holloway, and how he spent 15 years turning revenge into an art form. But like all great art, this masterpiece has layers. And the final layer? It'll make you question everything you think you know about justice, revenge, and the price we pay for both. Before we dive into this twisted tale that spans decades, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this don't just entertain, they haunt you long after they're over. And trust me, you're going to want to discuss this ending with someone. Because what Marcus Holloway did, it's either the most brilliant revenge in history, or the most horrifying mistake ever made. Marcus Holloway was born into the kind of wealth that most people can't even imagine. The Holloway family had been building their fortune for 5 generations, starting with steel mills in the 1800s, and evolving into a diversified empire that touched everything from real estate to technology to media. Picture the most exclusive boarding schools, summer homes in the Hamptons, winters in Switzerland. Marcus grew up in a world where money wasn't just abundant, it was assumed. Where influence wasn't earned, it was inherited. Where the family name opened doors that others didn't even know existed. But here's the thing about Marcus. He wasn't your typical spoiled rich kid. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant. At 16, he was already sitting in on board meetings. At 18, he'd developed a revolutionary algorithm for predicting market fluctuations that made the family another $100 million. At 22, fresh out of Harvard Business School, he was being groomed to take over the entire Holloway empire. Marcus had everything: intelligence, charisma, unlimited resources, and most importantly, he had a family that loved him. His father Richard was tough but fair, a man who'd taught Marcus that wealth meant responsibility. His mother Elizabeth was elegant and kind, the type of woman who could command a room with a smile. And his younger sister Claire was Marcus's best friend, the one person who saw him not as the heir to a fortune, but just as her big brother. The Holloway family was untouchable. They had politicians in their pocket, judges who owed them favors, and enough money to make any problem disappear. They lived in a penthouse that took up the entire top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, with views that stretched from Central Park to the Hudson River. Marcus thought he was invincible. He was about to learn how wrong he was. It started on a Tuesday in October, just 3 days before Marcus's 25th birthday. He was in the family's downtown office, reviewing quarterly reports, when his assistant burst through the door with a look of pure panic. "Mr. Holloway, you need to see the news. Now." Marcus turned on the wall-mounted television just in time to see a breaking news report that would destroy his world in 60 seconds flat. Federal agents raided Holloway Industries headquarters this morning, executing search warrants in connection with allegations of massive securities fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Sources close to the investigation suggest the charges could result in the complete dissolution of the company and criminal prosecution for senior executives. Marcus stared at the screen, watching federal agents carrying boxes out of buildings that had belonged to his family for decades. This wasn't possible. The Holloway family had teams of lawyers, accountants, compliance officers. They were meticulous about staying within the bounds of the law. His phone rang. His father. "Marcus, don't come home. Don't go to any of the properties. They've frozen everything. Bank accounts, real estate, investments, everything. We need to meet somewhere safe." That evening, Marcus met his family at a small diner in Queens, the kind of place none of them had ever set foot in before. His father looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. His mother couldn't stop crying. Claire just stared at the table, holding Marcus's hand like she was afraid he might disappear. "It's Victor Ashford," his father said quietly. "It has to be. He's been planning this for years." Victor Ashford. Marcus knew the name, of course. Ashford Industries was one of their biggest competitors, run by a man who'd been trying to destroy the Holloway family for over a decade. There had been bad blood between the families going back generations, something about a business deal gone wrong in the 1960s that had cost the Ashfords millions. But the evidence, Marcus said. They must have evidence to get warrants like this. His father's laugh was bitter. Evidence can be manufactured, son. Documents can be forged. Digital records can be altered. When you have enough money and the right connections, you can make anyone look guilty of anything. 3 weeks later, Richard Holloway was found dead in his jail cell, officially ruled a suicide. Elizabeth Holloway suffered a massive heart attack during her husband's funeral and died before the ambulance arrived. Claire, unable to cope with watching her entire family destroyed, took her own life on a cold December morning, leaving behind only a note that said, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I can't watch them win." In 6 months, Marcus Holloway went from heir to a billion-dollar empire to a man with nothing. No family, no money, no friends, because in high society, association with scandal is contagious, and everyone who'd once sought his favor now crossed the street to avoid him. The criminal charges against Marcus were eventually dropped. There was never any real evidence against him personally. But by then it didn't matter. Ashford Industries had acquired the Holloway assets for pennies on the dollar, through a series of shell companies and legal maneuvers. Victor Ashford had gotten everything he'd wanted. Everything except Marcus himself. Marcus Holloway vanished from New York society completely. One day he was there, fighting lawsuits and trying to salvage some piece of his family's legacy. The next day he was gone. Some people said he'd fled the country, probably to some non-extradition nation where he could live quietly on hidden offshore accounts. Others claimed he'd committed suicide like his father, that his body just hadn't been found yet. The more creative rumors suggested he'd gone completely insane and was living homeless on the streets, broken by the loss of everything he'd ever known. All of those people were wrong. Marcus had gone somewhere much more dangerous than exile or death or madness. He'd gone to school. For 2 years, Marcus Holloway studied Victor Ashford the way a scientist studies a specimen. He learned everything: Ashford's business practices, his personal habits, his family structure, his psychological profile. He read every interview Ashford had ever given, watched every public appearance, analyzed every business decision going back 30 years. Marcus discovered that Victor Ashford was a collector. Not of art or antiques, but of victories. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he collected them, keeping trophies of their destruction like a serial killer keeping souvenirs. In Ashford's private office, Marcus learned, there was a wall of photographs. Every business rival he'd destroyed, every family he'd ruined, every life he'd ended in pursuit of more power. Richard Holloway's photograph was prominently displayed, right next to the suicide note he'd left in his jail cell. But Marcus also learned something else about Victor Ashford. The man had weaknesses. He was arrogant, prone to underestimating opponents he thought were beneath him. He had a pathological need for control that made him micromanage every aspect of his businesses, and most importantly, he had blind spots when it came to the people he loved. Victor Ashford had 3 children, David, the eldest, being groomed to take over the company, Sarah, the middle child, brilliant but rebellious, and Michael, the youngest, artistic and sensitive in ways that disappointed his ruthless father. Marcus spent the next 3 years becoming the kind of person who could get close to the Ashford family. He changed his appearance, his name, his entire identity. He studied acting, psychology, social manipulation. He became a master of reinvention. And then, when he was ready, Marcus Holloway ceased to exist entirely. In his place emerged someone new, someone with a different face, a different background, a different life story, someone who could infiltrate the Ashford family and destroy them from within, someone who called himself Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed first appeared in the Ashford social circle at a charity gala in the spring of 2018. He was introduced as a successful venture capitalist from California, recently relocated to New York to expand his business. Charming, intelligent, well-dressed but not ostentatiously wealthy. Exactly the kind of person who could move through high society without raising suspicions. The persona was perfect, because it was partially true. Marcus had spent 5 years building Thomas Reed's identity from the ground up. Real investments, real companies, real money earned through legitimate means. The backstory wasn't fabricated. It was carefully constructed reality. Thomas Reed's first target wasn't Victor Ashford himself. That would have been too obvious, too risky. Instead, he focused on Sarah Ashford, Victor's 28-year-old daughter. Sarah was brilliant but frustrated, working in her father's company but constantly fighting against his controlling nature. She had her father's intelligence but her grandmother's compassion, which made her the black sheep of a family built on ruthless ambition. She was also lonely, despite being surrounded by wealth and privilege. Thomas Reed became exactly what Sarah Ashford didn't know she was looking for. He was successful enough to impress her father, but not so successful as to threaten him. He was intelligent enough to keep up with Sarah's sharp mind, but humble enough not to overshadow her. He listened to her complaints about her family without judging, offered advice without trying to control her. Within 6 months, Sarah Ashford was in love. Within a year, Thomas Reed had become a trusted friend to David Ashford and a mentor figure to young Michael. He attended family dinners, joined them on vacation, became the son that Victor had always wished David could be, and that David could never quite manage to become. But Thomas Reed's masterpiece was his relationship with Victor Ashford himself. He approached the older man not as a rival, but as a student. He asked for advice, showed respect for Victor's achievements, never tried to compete directly. He made himself indispensable by bringing Victor opportunities that were too good to pass up, deals that made the family even more money. Victor Ashford began to think of Thomas Reed as the perfect son-in-law. Smart, successful, respectful, and most importantly, someone who understood that the Ashford family came first, always. For 3 years, Thomas Reed played his part flawlessly. He became engaged to Sarah. He was given a position on the board of Ashford Industries. He was included in family meetings where the most sensitive business was discussed. He had access to everything: financial records, legal documents, personal information, family secrets, and all the while, Marcus Holloway watched from behind Thomas Reed's eyes, gathering ammunition for the war he was planning to wage. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Because somewhere in those 3 years of pretending to love Sarah Ashford, of playing big brother to Michael, of being the son that David could never be for his father, Thomas Reed forgot he was supposed to be pretending. It started small. Thomas would catch himself genuinely laughing at one of Michael's jokes, or feeling real anger when Victor dismissed Sarah's ideas in board meetings. He found himself looking forward to family dinners not because they were opportunities to gather intelligence, but because he enjoyed the conversations. Sarah Ashford wasn't just a target anymore. She was brilliant, kind, funny in ways that surprised him. When she talked about her dreams for the company, about making it more ethical and sustainable, Thomas found himself wanting to help her achieve those goals. When she cried about her father's impossible expectations, Thomas felt genuine anger on her behalf. Michael Ashford, the youngest son, reminded Thomas painfully of his own sister Claire. Artistic, sensitive, struggling to find his place in a family that valued only strength and success, Thomas found himself protecting Michael from his father's criticism, encouraging his artistic pursuits, being the supportive family member that Marcus had been to Claire. Even David, the golden child groomed to inherit everything, wasn't the shallow, entitled heir Thomas had expected. He was thoughtful, burdened by expectations he'd never asked for, desperate for his father's approval, but slowly beginning to question whether that approval was worth the cost. And then there was Victor Ashford himself. Thomas had expected to find a monster, a cartoon villain who destroyed families for sport. Instead, he found a complicated man driven by his own traumatic past. Victor's father had lost everything to the Holloways in the 1960s, had died broken and poor, leaving Victor with a burning need to prove that the Ashford name meant something. The next 18 months were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Thomas Reed didn't just maintain his cover, he perfected it. He became indispensable to the Ashford family in ways that went far beyond being Sarah's fiancé. With David, Thomas played the role of mentor and friend. David was struggling with the pressure of being the heir apparent, making mistakes that frustrated his father. Thomas was there to offer support, advice, and most importantly, solutions to David's problems. But those solutions came with a price. They slowly made David dependent on Thomas's guidance, unable to make major decisions without consulting his future brother-in-law. With Michael, Thomas became the understanding older brother figure that the young man had never had. He encouraged Michael's art, even bought some of his paintings for substantial sums. He listened to Michael's complaints about the family business, his dreams of pursuing a different path. Thomas became Michael's confidant, the keeper of his secrets, the person Michael trusted more than anyone else in his family. But it was with Victor himself that Thomas played the longest game. He made himself invaluable to Ashford Industries, bringing in deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He demonstrated a ruthless business sense that impressed the older man, showing he could be just as cold and calculating when necessary. Thomas began feeding Victor information about their competitors, information that was always accurate, always valuable, and always obtained through Thomas's network of contacts. Victor began to rely on Thomas's intelligence gathering, never suspecting that those contacts were actually private investigators and corporate spies that Marcus had hired with the remains of his hidden offshore accounts. Most importantly, Thomas began to position himself as Victor's true successor. Not David, who was competent but lacked vision. Not Sarah, who was brilliant but too soft for the cutthroat world of high-stakes business. Thomas Reed was the future of Ashford Industries, the man who understood that power was the only thing that mattered in the end. Victor ate it up. Here was someone who truly understood him, who shared his vision for the company, who had the intelligence and ruthlessness to carry on the Ashford legacy. Victor began making plans to bring Thomas more deeply into the company's leadership, to groom him as his eventual replacement. But while Thomas Reed was building trust and gathering power, Marcus Holloway was building something else entirely. A trap 15 years in the making. He was documenting everything. Every illegal business practice, every bribe, every threat, every corrupt deal that Ashford Industries had been involved in for the past 2 decades. Thomas's position on the board gave him access to confidential documents, and his relationship with the family gave him knowledge of verbal agreements that were never written down. Marcus was building a case that would make the charges against his own family look like parking tickets by comparison. But a legal case wasn't enough. Victor Ashford had survived government investigations before, had enough lawyers and political connections to weather almost any storm. Marcus needed something that would destroy the man completely, something that would take away everything he valued most. So Marcus began to plan a series of revelations that would turn Victor's own family against him. He started dropping subtle hints to Sarah about some of her father's more questionable business practices. He began sharing with David some of the more ruthless things Victor had said about his son in private. He showed Michael documents that proved his father had been sabotaging his art career, buying his paintings through shell companies to manipulate him. Slowly, carefully, Marcus began to poison the relationships that Victor valued most. Not with lies, he didn't need lies. The truth about Victor Ashford was damning enough. And all the while, Thomas Reed continued to play the perfect son-in-law, the loyal friend, the trusted advisor. Right up until the night before his wedding to Sarah Ashford, when Marcus Holloway was finally ready to reveal himself and claim his revenge. Music stops, leaving only silence. But that's when Marcus discovered something that changed everything, something that made him realize his perfect plan had one fatal flaw. The night before his wedding, Thomas Reed was in his apartment, reviewing the final details of his plan. Tomorrow would be the culmination of 15 years of work. In front of 500 guests, he would reveal himself as Marcus Holloway, present evidence of Victor Ashford's crimes, and watch as the man's world crumbled around him. But first, he needed to secure the most damaging piece of evidence: Victor's personal files from his home office. Files that contained details about every illegal activity, every bribe, every life destroyed in the pursuit of power. Thomas had been slowly copying these files for months, but there were still some documents he needed, papers that Victor kept in a private safe. Sarah had given him the combination months ago, trusting him completely. She'd mentioned it casually one evening, saying she was glad there was finally someone else her father trusted enough to have access to his most important documents. Thomas entered the Ashford mansion using his key, moving quietly through the darkened halls. The house was empty, The family was staying at the estate in the Hamptons for the wedding weekend. This was his last chance to gather the final pieces of evidence. He made his way to Victor's study, opened the safe, and began photographing documents with a high-resolution camera. Bank records showing bribes to government officials, correspondence detailing illegal arms sales to embargoed nations, contract kill orders disguised as business memos. And then Thomas found something that made his hands shake as he held it. It was a thick file labeled Holloway Investigation, Confidential. Inside were documents that Marcus had never seen before, evidence that told a completely different story about what had happened to his family. The charges against the Holloway family hadn't been fabricated by Victor Ashford. They'd been real. Richard Holloway had been guilty of massive securities fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The evidence was overwhelming, detailed, undeniable. Marcus's father had been stealing from pension funds, manipulating stock prices, using the family's charitable foundation as a front for illegal activities. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Marcus learned about his own role in the family's crimes. The algorithm he'd developed at 18. The one that had made the family millions? It had been used primarily for insider trading, manipulating markets based on information that Richard Holloway obtained through bribes and corruption. Marcus's brilliant creation had been the engine that drove much of his family's illegal activity. Every dollar Marcus had inherited, every privilege he'd enjoyed, every opportunity he'd been given, all of it had been built on theft and corruption that had ruined thousands of innocent people's lives. Marcus Holloway sat in Victor Ashford's study at 3 a.m, surrounded by evidence that his entire life had been a lie. His family hadn't been innocent victims destroyed by a rival's machinations. They'd been criminals who'd finally been caught, and their downfall had been justice, not revenge. But there was more. At the bottom of the file was a document that made Marcus's blood turn to ice, a psychiatric evaluation of Claire Holloway, written just weeks before her suicide. The evaluation revealed that Claire had known about their father's crimes all along. She'd been helping him hide money in offshore accounts, had been complicit in some of the illegal schemes. Her suicide hadn't been driven by grief over losing her family's fortune. It had been driven by guilt over the people they'd hurt. Claire's final note, the one Marcus had never been allowed to see, was included in the file. It didn't just say, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I can't watch them win." The full note read, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I can't live with what we've done. I can't watch them win, but I can't live with us winning either. Some victories aren't worth the cost. I hope you can forgive us someday." Marcus understood now why Victor Ashford kept Claire's photograph on his trophy wall. Not because he'd destroyed an innocent girl, but because he'd helped expose the crimes that she couldn't live with committing. 15 years of planning. 15 years of hatred. 15 years of building an identity based on avenging a family that had never deserved avenging. Marcus Holloway had spent half his life becoming a monster to fight a monster that had actually been a hero. But the revelation that should have ended Marcus's quest for revenge only made him more determined to complete it, because now he understood something crucial about Victor Ashford, something that made him more dangerous than Marcus had ever realized. Victor Ashford was everything Marcus had pretended to be. A man seeking justice, a man trying to protect innocent people from predators, a man who sometimes had to make hard choices for the greater good, which meant that Marcus Holloway was everything he'd accused Victor of being. A man who destroyed families, a man who hurt innocent people, a man who chose revenge over justice. The wedding was tomorrow. Sarah Ashford, innocent of her father's activities and ignorant of Marcus's, would marry the man she loved and trusted. David and Michael would welcome their new brother-in-law into the family. Victor would gain the son and successor he'd always wanted, and Marcus Holloway, master manipulator, expert deceiver, would give them all exactly what they deserved for the crime of stopping his family's decades of theft and corruption. He was going to destroy them all, not because they were guilty of anything, but because he was too far down this path to turn back now. The Ashford estate had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. 500 guests filled the elaborate gardens, the ceremony taking place on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The flowers alone had cost more than most people made in a year, and every detail was perfect. Sarah Ashford looked radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, a vision of happiness and hope as she prepared to marry the man she believed would be her partner for life. Her brothers stood as groomsmen, David proud and Michael nervous but excited. Victor Ashford beamed with satisfaction as he prepared to walk his daughter down the aisle to marry the man he considered the perfect addition to their family. Thomas Reed stood at the altar, impeccably dressed, the picture of a nervous but happy groom. To everyone present, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a successful businessman who'd won the heart of Victor Ashford's daughter and earned the respect of the entire family. Only Marcus Holloway, hidden behind Thomas Reed's perfect facade, knew what was really about to happen. The ceremony began beautifully. Sarah walked down the aisle on her father's arm, tears of joy streaming down her face. The officiant spoke about love, commitment, and the joining of two families. The guests smiled and wiped away tears of their own, and then came the moment when the officiant asked if anyone had a reason why the marriage should not proceed. "I do," Thomas Reed's voice carried clearly across the garden, and 500 guests turned to stare at him in confusion. Sarah's face went white with shock. Victor Ashford's expression shifted from joy to concern to growing alarm. "Thomas," Sarah whispered. "What are you doing?" Thomas Reed smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile that Sarah knew and loved. It was something else entirely. Cold, calculated, predatory. "My name isn't Thomas Reed," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the garden. "My name is Marcus Holloway." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victor Ashford's face went ashen as he realized what was happening. David and Michael looked confused, not yet understanding the significance of the name. But Sarah understood. She'd studied her family's history, knew about the Holloways, knew what her father had done to them. The man she loved, the man she'd trusted with her heart and her future, was the son of the family her father had destroyed. "You're dead," Victor said quietly, his voice barely audible over the shocked murmurs of the guests. "Marcus Holloway died years ago." "No," Marcus replied, still standing at the altar where he'd been about to marry Victor's daughter. Marcus Holloway disappeared. He spent 15 years learning how to become Thomas Reed, so he could get close enough to your family to destroy it the same way you destroyed his. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness the culmination of the longest revenge plot in modern history. Victor Ashford destroyed my family based on fabricated evidence, drove my father to suicide, caused my mother's death, and drove my sister to take her own life. Today I return the favor. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. In here is evidence of every crime Victor Ashford has committed over the past 20 years. Bribery, corruption, illegal arms dealing, contract killing. All of it documented and verified. Long pause. But then Marcus did something that no one expected. Something that changed the entire trajectory of the moment. He set the folder on fire. "But I'm not going to use it," Marcus continued, watching the evidence burn. "Because this morning I learned something that changed everything. My family weren't the victims I thought they were. We were the criminals. My father was guilty of everything Victor Ashford accused him of, and more." Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. David and Michael stood frozen, not understanding what was happening. Victor stared at Marcus with growing realization. "So instead of revealing your crimes," Marcus said, "I'm going to reveal mine." Music returns, complex and psychologically intense. And that's when Marcus Holloway began to tell the truth. Not the version he'd believed for 15 years, but the real truth. About his family's corruption, about the innocent people they'd hurt, about Claire's guilt and Richard's actual crimes. But most importantly, about what he'd done to the Ashford family over the past 4 years. "For 4 years," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the stunned garden, "I have systematically manipulated this family. I made Sarah fall in love with a man who doesn't exist. I became David's most trusted advisor, while secretly sabotaging his confidence and judgment. I encouraged Michael's art, while isolating him from potential mentors who could have helped his career. I turned you against each other. Every doubt Sarah had about her father's business practices, I planted those. Every insecurity David felt about his ability to lead the company, I cultivated those. Every feeling Michael had that his family didn't understand or support him, I nurtured those. The wedding guests sat in horrified silence, not understanding exactly what they were witnessing, but recognizing that they were seeing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for decades. Sarah was crying now. Not tears of joy, but of complete devastation. The man she'd loved, the man she'd planned to build a life with, was revealing himself to be her family's greatest enemy. But the cruelest part, Marcus continued, wasn't the manipulation. It was that I fell in love with you anyway. Sarah, you are everything I never expected to find in Victor Ashford's daughter. You're kind, intelligent, ethical in ways that would have made your grandfather proud. David, you're not the weak heir I thought you were. You're a good man trying to live up to impossible standards. Michael, your art isn't the self-indulgent hobby your father thinks it is. It's genuine talent that deserves recognition. Marcus turned to face Victor directly, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a pain that 15 years hadn't diminished. And Victor, you're not the monster I thought you were. You're just a man who spent his life trying to protect innocent people from families like mine. Everything you did to the Holloways was justice, not revenge. My father destroyed pension funds, ruined retirement savings, stole from charities. You stopped him. So now I'm going to tell you all what I really am. I'm not a victim seeking justice. I'm not a hero fighting corruption. I'm a man who spent 15 years becoming the very thing I thought I was fighting against. Marcus reached into his other pocket and pulled out a second set of documents. These ones he didn't burn. These are confessions, written statements detailing every law I've broken, every person I've manipulated, every crime I've committed in pursuit of my revenge. Securities fraud, identity theft, corporate espionage, psychological manipulation, all of it. Sarah, the prenuptial agreement you signed, it wasn't to protect your family's assets from me. It was to protect my assets from you. I've been moving money, buying properties, building a fortune using the same illegal methods my father used. I told myself it was for justice, but it was really just theft, with a more palatable motivation. The wedding guests were completely silent now, transfixed by this impossible confession. Camera phones were recording everything, though most people seemed too shocked to remember they had them. David, every piece of business advice I gave you was designed to make you dependent on me, to undermine your confidence so you'd never be able to lead this company without my guidance. I was positioning myself to take over everything your family built. Michael, I didn't encourage your art because I believed in your talent. I encouraged it because I wanted to drive a wedge between you and your father, to make you see him as the obstacle to your dreams instead of someone trying to prepare you for a harsh world. Marcus turned back to Sarah, and for the first time since he'd begun speaking, his voice cracked with genuine emotion. And Sarah, I didn't just manipulate you into falling in love with me. I manipulated myself into falling in love with you. I told myself that my feelings were real, that they proved I was different from my father. But love that begins with deception isn't love at all. It's just another form of theft. Sarah stood up slowly from her seat in the front row, her wedding dress rustling in the ocean breeze. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the complete silence, everyone heard her. Did you ever love me? The real me? Or did you just love the idea of loving Victor Ashford's daughter? Marcus looked at her for a long moment before answering. And when he did, his voice was filled with more honesty than he'd shown in 15 years. I don't know anymore. I've been lying for so long, I'm not sure I remember what the truth feels like. What happened next wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was just sad. Victor Ashford walked slowly to the altar where Marcus stood, and for a moment, the two men who had defined each other's lives for so many years simply looked at each other. Why? Victor asked quietly. Why reveal all this now? You could have gone through with the marriage, taken everything we had, destroyed us completely. Why stop? Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. Because this morning I realized that if I went through with my plan, I would become exactly what my father was. Someone who destroys innocent people to get what he wants. And you, your children, you're innocent of everything except stopping my family's crimes. But there's another reason, Marcus continued. I realized that my revenge was already complete. "I didn't need to destroy your family, Victor. I already had." The truth of that statement hit everyone present like a physical blow. Marcus was right. The Ashford family would never recover from this moment. The trust between Victor and his children had been poisoned by years of Marcus's subtle manipulations. Sarah's ability to trust anyone had been shattered. David's confidence in his own judgment was gone. Michael's relationship with his father might never recover. "I spent 15 years planning to hurt you the way you hurt me," Marcus said to Victor. "But I was wrong about how you hurt me. I thought you destroyed my family through lies and manipulation. Actually, you destroyed my family by revealing the truth about what we were. So I decided to return the favor. I'm not destroying your family with lies, Victor. I'm destroying it with the truth about what I am." Marcus turned to address the wedding guests one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something unprecedented. Not the perfect revenge, but the confession of someone who spent 15 years becoming a monster to fight monsters who turned out to be heroes." He looked back at the Ashford family. Sarah still crying. David and Michael looking lost and confused. Victor standing stoically as his world crumbled around him. "I'm going to turn myself in to the FBI after this ceremony. The evidence I've gathered about my own crimes is more than enough to send me to prison for the rest of my life, which is exactly what I deserve. But before I go, I want you all to understand something important. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens when we let our pain make our choices for us, when we decide that our suffering gives us the right to cause suffering in others." Marcus began walking down the aisle, away from the altar, away from the family he'd spent years infiltrating and manipulating. "My father was a criminal who hurt innocent people." Victor Ashford stopped him, which was the right thing to do. "My response should have been gratitude, not revenge. Instead, I spent 15 years becoming worse than my father ever was. Every person in this garden has been hurt by someone. Every person here has felt the desire for revenge, the satisfaction of seeing someone who wronged them suffer in return. This is what happens when we give in to those feelings." Marcus paused at the back of the garden, turning to look one last time at the family he was leaving in ruins. The cycle of revenge doesn't end with justice. It ends with someone choosing to break it, even when breaking it means admitting you were the villain all along. And with that, Marcus Holloway walked away from the Ashford estate, away from his perfect revenge, and toward the police cars that were already arriving. He'd called them himself that morning, as soon as he'd decided to confess everything. The story should end there, shouldn't it? With Marcus Holloway finally taking responsibility for his actions, turning himself in, accepting the consequences of his 15-year quest for revenge. But stories like this don't have clean endings. The ripples of Marcus's actions continued long after he was led away in handcuffs, long after the wedding guests went home with the most incredible story they'd ever witnessed firsthand. Sarah Ashford never married. She left New York 6 months after the wedding that never was, moving to a small town in Vermont, where she opened a bookstore and tried to rebuild her ability to trust her own judgment about people. She never spoke publicly about Marcus Holloway, but those who knew her said she spent years in therapy trying to understand how she could have loved someone so completely while knowing them so little. David Ashford took over the family business, but he was never the same confident leader his father had been. The knowledge that his most trusted advisor had been manipulating him for years made him second-guess every decision, seek multiple opinions on every choice. Ashford Industries became more ethical under his leadership, but less profitable, less aggressive, less successful. Michael Ashford became a successful artist, but he never forgave his father for the years of criticism and control. The revelation that Marcus had been manipulating their relationship didn't repair the damage that had been done. It just added another layer of confusion and pain to an already complicated dynamic. And Victor Ashford. Victor spent his remaining years trying to understand how he'd been so completely deceived by someone he'd come to love like a son. The man who'd built his reputation on being able to read people, to see through deception and manipulation, had been completely blindsided by Marcus Holloway's performance. Victor died 3 years later, officially from a heart attack. But everyone who knew him understood that he'd died from the weight of realizing that his quest for justice had created an enemy more dangerous than any of the criminals he'd Vaught, Marcus Holloway was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for financial crimes, identity theft, and conspiracy. He served his time quietly, refusing all interview requests, declining to write the book that publishers offered him millions to produce. But here's where the story takes its final, most devastating turn. 7 years into his sentence, Marcus received a letter that changed everything he thought he understood about his own story. The letter was from Helen Vance, the same Helen Vance who had orchestrated Sarah Chen's downfall in our earlier story. But Helen's letter to Marcus revealed something that made his 15-year quest for revenge look like child's play. Helen Vance was Victor Ashford's sister. Helen Vance had been born Helen Ashford, Victor's younger sister by 10 years. She'd been working for the Chen family under her married name, gathering intelligence about their financial crimes, when she'd been framed for theft and sent to prison. But she hadn't been framed by the Chen family, as she'd told Sarah. She'd been framed by the Holloway family, who had discovered her true identity and decided to eliminate the threat she posed to their criminal enterprise. Richard Holloway had orchestrated Helen's imprisonment to protect his own illegal activities. And when Helen had finally been released, she'd spent years planning revenge not just against the Chens, but against the Holloways as well. Helen's letter to Marcus revealed the true scope of her plan. She had manipulated Sarah Chen into destroying her own life, yes. But she had also been manipulating Marcus Holloway from the very beginning. The anonymous tip that had led Marcus to discover his family's crimes? That had been Helen, feeding him information at exactly the right moment to send him down the path of revenge against Victor Ashford. The offshore accounts that had funded Marcus's transformation into Thomas Reed? Those had been secretly managed by Helen, who had been moving money and resources to support Marcus's quest, while making him think he was doing it all himself. Every step of Marcus's 15-year plan had been guided by Helen Ashford Vance, who had been playing a game so complex that it spanned decades and involved destroying multiple families. But why? Why would Victor Ashford's own sister orchestrate his downfall? Because Helen blamed Victor for her imprisonment. She believed that if her brother had been more careful in his investigation of the Holloway family, if he had protected her identity better, she never would have been discovered and framed. Helen Ashford had spent 30 years planning the perfect revenge against both families. The Holloways who had imprisoned her, and the Ashfords who had failed to protect her. She had turned Marcus Holloway into a weapon against his own family's enemies, then watched as he destroyed himself in the process of destroying them. Marcus read Helen's letter in his prison cell, understanding finally that he hadn't been the architect of his revenge at all. He'd been just another pawn in a game played by someone far more patient, far more ruthless, and far more brilliant than he'd ever been. Helen's letter ended with a simple statement. Now you understand what it means to be used by someone you trusted. Now you know how it feels to discover that your entire life was someone else's chess game. I hope the knowledge brings you the same peace it brought me. Marcus Holloway folded the letter carefully and sat in his cell, trying to process the revelation that his 15-year quest for revenge had been orchestrated by the sister of the man he'd been trying to destroy. He had thought he was seeking justice for his family. Then he'd learned he was seeking revenge for criminals who deserved their fate. Now he discovered that even his revenge had been nothing more than someone else's revenge, played out through him like a puppet on strings. How many layers deep did the deception go? How many people seeking revenge were actually just weapons in someone else's war? How many victims were actually pawns? How many heroes were actually villains? How many villains were actually just broken people being manipulated by someone even more broken? Marcus realized that he might never know the full truth about anything that had happened to him. The only thing he could be certain of was that Helen Ashford had won the longest game of all. Years passed in prison. Marcus Holloway became a model inmate, quiet and thoughtful, spending his days in the library reading philosophy and psychology, trying to understand the nature of manipulation, revenge, and justice. Other inmates sometimes asked him about his crime. The story of the wedding day confession had become legendary, a cautionary tale told and retold, until it became almost mythical. But Marcus rarely spoke about it, except to say that he'd learned that revenge was a poison that hurt the person seeking it more than their target. But late at night, alone in his cell, Marcus would think about Helen Ashford and wonder if she felt satisfied with her victory. She had orchestrated the destruction of both the Holloway and Ashford families, had manipulated multiple people across multiple decades, had planned and executed the most complex revenge scheme in modern history. But what had she gained from it? The Holloway family had already been destroyed when Marcus began his quest. The Ashford family's destruction had only hurt Victor's innocent children. Helen herself was still alone, still bitter, still defined by events that had happened decades ago. Marcus began to understand that revenge was not just a poison, it was a prison. Helen Ashford was just as trapped by her need for vengeance as Marcus had been, as Sarah Chen had been, as every person who ever chose hatred over healing. The only difference was that Helen was better at building her prison out of other people's lives. In his 8th year of imprisonment, Marcus received another letter. This one was from Sarah Ashford, the woman he had manipulated and deceived, the woman whose wedding day he had turned into a nightmare. Sarah's letter was brief. "I've spent 7 years trying to hate you for what you did to my family. I finally realized that hating you only gives you more power over my life. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I hope you find yours." Marcus read that letter dozens of times, understanding finally what it meant to receive grace from someone he had deeply wronged. Sarah Ashford had chosen to break the cycle that had consumed his life, her father's life, and Helen's life. She had chosen forgiveness over revenge, healing over hatred, peace over the satisfaction of seeing her enemy suffer. Marcus wrote back to Sarah, a letter that took him weeks to compose. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He had no right to ask for that. Instead, he thanked her for showing him what strength really looked like. "True strength," he wrote, "isn't the ability to destroy your enemies. It's the ability to choose not to become one yourself." Marcus Holloway was released from prison after serving 12 years of his sentence. He was 54 years old, gray-haired, carrying the weight of everything he'd done and everything that had been done to him. He didn't try to rebuild his fortune or reclaim his identity. Instead, he moved to a small town in Oregon, got a job at a local library, and lived quietly under his real name for the first time in decades. He never married, never had children, never tried to rebuild the life he'd lost, but he did something more important. He broke the cycle that had defined his family for generations. When young people in the town faced betrayals, injustices or losses that filled them with rage, Marcus would listen to their stories without judgment, and sometimes, if they were ready to hear it, he would tell them about the cost of revenge, about the price of letting hatred make their choices for them. He never heard from Helen Ashford again. But sometimes he would wonder if she was still out there, still playing games with people's lives, still trapped in the prison she'd built out of her own need for vengeance. Marcus hoped that someday, Helen would receive a letter like the one Sarah had sent him, a letter offering forgiveness, offering the possibility of peace, offering an escape from the cycle that had consumed so many lives. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not justice, not the satisfaction of seeing our enemies destroyed. It's about the choice we all face when someone hurts us deeply. Do we choose to let that hurt define us, or do we choose to define ourselves? Do we choose to become the kind of person who breaks cycles, or the kind who perpetuates them? Marcus Holloway spent 15 years becoming a master manipulator, a brilliant deceiver, a patient architect of destruction. He was capable of incredible things when motivated by hatred. But Sarah Ashford, with a single letter of forgiveness, accomplished something that all of Marcus's intelligence and planning never could. She set herself free. The game is always still being played somewhere. Someone is plotting revenge, nursing grievances, building elaborate schemes to hurt the people who hurt them. The players change, but the game remains the same. The only way to win is to refuse to play. The only way to be free is to choose forgiveness over revenge, healing over hatred, peace over the temporary satisfaction of watching someone else suffer. Marcus Holloway learned that lesson too late to save his family, Too late to save the Ashfords. Too late to save himself from years of imprisonment and regret. But he learned it in time to save the most important person of all, the person he chose to become after the game was over. On a quiet Tuesday in March, 15 years after his release from prison, Marcus Holloway received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph and a brief note. The photograph showed Helen Ashford, now in her 80s, sitting alone in what appeared to be an expensive nursing home. She looked frail, diminished, surrounded by luxury but utterly isolated. The note was in Helen's handwriting, shaky now with age. I collected so many victories over the years, destroyed so many enemies, orchestrated so many perfect revenges, but in the end I realize I never collected the one thing I actually needed: peace. I hope you found what I couldn't. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long time, seeing in Helen's eyes the same emptiness he'd carried for so many years, the same loneliness that comes from building your life around hatred instead of love. He wrote back to Helen, sending his letter to the nursing home. It was brief, echoing the words Sarah had written to him years earlier. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because we both deserve peace. Marcus never knew if Helen received his letter, or what she thought if she did, but he hoped that somewhere, somehow, the cycle that had consumed so many lives might finally be broken, because that's the only victory that actually matters in the end. Not the destruction of our enemies, but the construction of our own peace. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the freedom that comes from choosing forgiveness. The collector's game is finally over. And for the first time in decades, everyone who played it has the chance to win. All they have to do is choose to stop playing. So there you have it, the story of Marcus Holloway and the 15-year revenge plot that consumed 3 generations and multiple families. A story about the true cost of revenge, the complexity of justice, and the power of forgiveness to break cycles that seem unbreakable. What did you think? Did Helen deserve to win after orchestrating such an elaborate plan? Was Marcus's confession at the wedding heroic or just another form of selfishness? And most importantly, do you think you could forgive someone who manipulated you the way Marcus manipulated the Ashfords? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. These are the questions that keep us up at night. The moral dilemmas that don't have easy answers. If this story made you think, made you question your own capacity for revenge and forgiveness, then smash that like button and subscribe for more psychological thrillers that explore the darkest corners of human nature. And remember, the most important choice we ever make is what we do when someone hurts us. Do we choose to hurt them back, or do we choose to heal ourselves? I'll see you in the next story. Until then, may your revenge be swift, your justice be fair, and your forgiveness be genuine.